from Anshe Sfard Bethel Emeth Congregation. It's time to take 10 minutes for Torah with Rabbi Joel Finkelstein.
Welcome to our discussion of Shavuot, a holiday of Torah. If we ask, what is Shavuot? Is it a holiday of Torah, Tefillah, Gemilas Chesed? Is it a holiday of receiving the Torah? Is it a holiday of prayer, a holiday of kindness? Clearly, 99% of the people would answer, it's a holiday of Torah. Zman Matan Toratenu. It's a time when we receive the Torah at Mount Sinai. There's no question about it. What I'd like to show today is that there's another way of looking at it. If we ask, is Shavuot a time of Itra'uta de Le'ela, Utra'uta de L'tata? Is it a time when God stirred up His love from above, or is it a time that we, the Jews, stirred up our love for God from below? Again, you would tend to answer that it came from above. After all, Talmud says, Kafal le'em har kegigit, that God thrust the mountain over our heads and threatened to bury us there. We were forced to accept the Torah. It's true that we said, Na'aseh v'nishma. We did say that we would accept the Torah, we would hear, we would listen. But basically, it seems clear it's a holiday of Torah. Torah which came from above was given to us below. Comes the Chidushei Harim, grandfather of the Sfas Emes, and he says, no, this is a holiday of Torah and Tefillah, of Torah and prayer. How's that? The Sfas Emes says that the truth is that Shavuot is a time when we not only get the Torah from God, but we also get something else from God. We get the ability to receive the Torah. So there too again, the notion is of this holiday being not only driven from above, but even the receiving of the Torah itself is driven by God as well. He gives us that ability to receive the Torah. Comes to his grandfather, the Chidushei Harim, and he says, well, why do you think we read Ruth, the book of Ruth? Why do we read that on Shavuot? And he says, because yes, it's a time when we receive the Torah. Ruth received the Torah, she accepted the Torah, but it's also a symbol of King David, David being the descendant of Ruth, David being the symbol of Ne'im Zmirot Yisrael, the sweet singer of Israel. David is all about prayer. We read the Megillah of Ruth to remind us that Shavuot is not only about Torah, but it's also about prayer. And where do we see that in the story of the receiving of the Torah? The Sfas Emes says something surprising. He says, when we say Na'aseh v'nishma, it sounds like we will hear the Torah and we'll do the Torah. It's all about God giving us the Torah. Comes the Sfas Emes and he says, no, that actually when it comes to prayer, prayer is like Osei Dvaro. Prayer is actually the Na'aseh. Prayer has to do with the doing. We said we would do. That was the voice of Yaakov, the voice of saying that we would do, the voice of Torah. That actually, when we receive the Torah, Nishma means we'll do the Nishma means that we'll do the Torah, and Na'aseh, to do, has to do with prayer. It's an interesting connection that he makes. Rabbi Soloveitchik asks the question, how do we relate to God? What are the ways in which a person can find God? So we say, well, you can relate to God through the mind. God is all about thought. If you can know the mind of God by looking at His creations, science, the wonders of nature, if you can look at the Torah, which is also the mind of God, you can have a relationship with God. So that this very study of Torah, the receiving of Torah, is also a prayerful relationship. It's about a relationship, a connection with God. Avodah shebalev, it's a heartfelt relationship and worship of God. It's not just God talking to you, but it's a relationship with Him. You can also relate to God through prayer, through emotion, through the heart. It's another way of connecting with God, feeling God. But then there's another way, and this relates to prayer as well. And that is that by doing the mitzvos. When we say na'aseh, when we say we do the mitzvos, you say, well, doing is, that's not prayer, there's mitzvos, doing the mitzvos, and then there's prayer, there's two different things. Sfas Emes is saying is that when you do a mitzvah, you're also in conversation with God. You see, God comes to us and He says, do this, do that, do Shabbat, put on your tefillin, honor your parents, keep the Shabbat. And then when we do that, we are in conversation with God. We are in response to God. Sometimes the conversation goes awry. God says, do it, and we start to feel ourselves not doing it. And at that moment, we're in a sort of a silent conversation with God. We're sort of arguing with God. We're sort of giving God a hard time. And when we do the thing that God asked us to do, when we don't do the thing that God asked us not to do, then we're in response to God. So that when we get the Torah, and the Jews say they'll do it, and the Jews do it, Naaseh, that the doing of Torah is also a type of prayer. It's a type of connection to God through the prayer. I saw in some books, it mentions that when we're studying on the night of Shavuot, many people stay up all night studying. When you're studying, it's such an eight ratzon, it's such a beautiful time. Throw in a few prayers. While you're there, pray for a friend who needs to get married. Pray for a friend who's sick. God forbid, someone has cancer. Someone is missing. Someone's having trouble. Pray for them, because it's good to connect the Torah and the tefillah, these two pillars of Judaism, the prayer and the receiving of the Torah. So we say that Mount Sinai has an element not only of Torah, but an element of prayer as well. The book of Ruth speaks not only of Ruth accepting the mitzvos and the commandments and becoming Jewish, like the Jews at Sinai, but also it reminds us of King David, the sweet singer of Israel, the one who really shows us how to pray. Says the Sfas Emes, there's another point. At Mount Sinai, you know what happened there? Yes, we received the Torah, but there was the first tamid, the first daily offering was given at Mount Sinai, Hasuyah B'Har Sinai. The first of the daily offerings ever was offered at Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is not only the place of receiving the Torah, but it's also the place of the first worship of God by the Jewish community. That worship is we model today, we mimic it through the saying of the daily prayers. So that Mount Sinai is an image not only of Torah, but also of prayer. Finally, says the Sfas Emes, in the book of Ruth, the deeds of Ruth become Torah. Whatever Ruth did, it became a book of the Torah. And so too, what we do as well can become Torah. And that's our prayer, the stirring from below. We have a response to God. A Jew doing the Torah, living a life with mistakes, without mistakes, doing the right thing, even sometimes doing the wrong thing. That's our Torah, that's our lesson for the next generation. Do this, don't do it that way. And that too is our prayer, that's our response to God. That's our words, that's our Torah. And together, the message is that on Shavuos, it's not only God speaks to us, but by listening to the Torah, by following the Torah, accepting the Torah, that's our prayer back to God as well. Thank you for joining us here today at the Anshe Sfar Beth Lemeth congregation for a discussion of Shavuot. Join us each week for discussions of Parsha, holidays, various mitzvot. And thanks to Jason Lefkowitz, our producer. Thank you again for joining us.
This has been 10 Minutes for Torah with Rabbi Joel Finkelstein. To learn more, visit ASBEE.org.